Welcome, everyone. I'm Garrett Weinzierl, and my guest today is a professor of molecular plant pathology at NMSU, Dr. Steve Hanson. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, you have come to talk with me about GMOs, but before we do that, let's get to know you a little bit first. Could you tell me about your background?
I've got a PhD from the University of Wisconsin in plant pathology, late 90s, and have been working ever since in sort of plant pathology, reducing losses to pests and pathogens in crops, things like that for all the time since then. I think I've been here at NMSU as a professor since mid-2003.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you've been with the school for quite a while.
Yeah, getting there. I used to think I was one of the new faculty members, but maybe that's wearing off.
I know that feeling. Now, what kind of research have you done in the past?
Most of my research program has been aimed at reducing crop losses to pests and pathogens, and lots of things either directly or peripherally related to that.
Okay, so I can see where this is going. It makes sense that we're here talking about GMOs today.
Yeah, probably a lot of sense.
Okay, well, partially for me and also for the viewing public. What are GMOs?
Well, GMOs are GMO literally stands for genetically modified organism, and these are organisms that are created through the use of genetic engineering, which are a bunch of laboratory techniques for moving DNA and genes around in between organisms.
Okay. Now, how exactly is that done? How are GMOs created?
Well, this is one thing that the public is not very well informed on. The scientific community maybe hasn't done a good job describing this. But GMOs are actually created using what we know about a naturally occurring process in nature. Everybody's familiar with genetics, that parents transfer genes onto their kids. And in genetics, we call this vertical transmission. The parents pass the genes on to the progeny. Genetic engineering is a little bit different. It uses something that we call horizontal transmission. And this would be transferring DNA between species. And the public is really familiar with vertical transmission, but not very familiar with horizontal transmission. It turns out in nature there's a well-known plant disease that's caused lots and lots of trouble for crop producers since we've been producing crops. This disease is called crown gall disease, and it's caused by a bacterium, a free-living bacterium in the soil named Agrobacterium tumefaciens. This bacteria causes the disease by transferring some of its DNA into plant cells. It literally injects Agrobacterium genes into the plant cells, and these genes cause the plant to start producing food for Agrobacterium, and it also causes the plant cells to divide, basically setting up a food factory for Agrobacterium. So this is an example of horizontal gene transfer, where genes are transferred in between a bacteria and a plant. Most of the genetic engineering that we do today, scientists have figured this process out, and we've taken the disease-causing genes out of Agrobacterium, replaced them with genes that are useful for agriculture, and used Agrobacterium to move those genes into plants. So the genetic engineering we do today is really based on a natural process that was first discovered by plant pathologists.
Okay, yeah. So this Agrobacterium was the jumping off point was for GMOs.
Yeah, that's one of the beneficial, maybe unanticipated outcomes of basic research looking at understanding disease processes.
Okay, wow. And now it's now that I've heard that, it's kind of easy to understand why there is some negative connotations with GMOs. Could we talk about some of those myths? What are some of the common myths surrounding GMOs?
Well, there are many common myths, and it's maybe this is an appropriate, well-timed day to talk about this. We just had the news that Facebook and Google are going to start trying to suppress fake news stories or things like that. There are a lot of misinformation, disinformation, all kinds of things. And it's unfortunate because all of this really gets in the way of some productive discussions on real issues that we should probably have related to GMOs. And, relative to those issues, I'm not always even sure where to start. You have a favorite that you've heard?
Well, there are so many. I mean, one is one that I hear all the time is that GMO crops increase pesticide use.
Yeah, that's a real common one. And that, in fact, just got published in the New York Times in an article maybe 2 weeks or so ago. The article said that GMO crops had not lived up to their promise because they have not increased yields and have not reduced pesticide use. On the pesticide use side, that really is not true. One good example are the two biggest, most widely used genetically engineered crops on the market today are the herbicide-tolerant crops and the insect-resistant crops. The insect-resistant crops are the Bt crops. And these use a gene from a naturally occurring soil bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis. Big word, but gets shortened down to Bt.
Okay.
That's why they call them Bt crops. This bacteria has a gene in it that produces a protein which is toxic to insects, and scientists engineered this protein over into plants. The plants express this crystal protein from Bacillus thuringiensis, and they become resistant to insects. In these crops, when these crops are used, we can reduce insecticide use on average of about 70%. So in this case, this genetically engineered crop has led to a tremendous reduction in pesticide use. Now, the other side of the coin are the herbicide-tolerant crops, like the Roundup-ready crops. In this case, these crops were designed to use an herbicide for weeding. They've inserted a gene into the herbicide-tolerant crops that makes them resistant to an herbicide. A farmer can do the weeding in the field with a sprayer. Several advantages like reduced erosion from tilling and things like that. In this case, these crops obviously have not reduced herbicide use. In fact, they were designed to use an herbicide. But when you look at it, herbicides were pretty heavily used before, and even with the wide adoption of these herbicide-tolerant crops, herbicide use across the country is up only marginally, about 5 to 10% increased. So I think, I can't speak for the people making the claim, but I think the genesis of this claim that genetically engineered crops have not reduced pesticide use, they're focusing only on these herbicide-tolerant crops, which have marginally increased herbicide use by a very small amount. But when you look at other crops, like the Bt insect-resistant crops, these have reduced use of insecticide by between 70 and 90%. With all the additional benefits. We don't spray insecticides in the fields. We don't hit non-target insects. We don't damage pollinator populations or beneficial insects. So this is really picking and choosing facts very selectively to make what's really not a very well substantiated point.
Right. It's not taking in the whole picture. It's true of certain GMOs, but not of all of them, and they're ignoring the ones that are convenient for there.
And then my work, and really, I'd speak broadly for the community, the goal of most people working in biotech and GMO crops is actually to increase sustainability, reduce chemical exposure, reduce environmental degradation. These really are the goals of the people developing the GMO crops. And it's unfortunate they get maligned with an image that's counter to that.
Okay. Now, what about some of the other myths surrounding GMOs? Another popular one is that no testing is required before GMO crops are used.
This is one that shows up in the media all the time, and I have no idea where this comes from or how it starts. The law requires that any genetically modified plant that makes its way into production in the United States has to be approved, has to be tested and approved. This myth that there's no testing required is just absolute nonsense. And in fact, they don't have to just get approval from one federal agency, but they actually have to clear approval by 3 different federal agencies. Before a genetically engineered crop gets on the market, it has to be tested, the data reviewed, and it has to get approval from the EPA, the USDA, and the FDA. And any one of those three agencies can block approval.
Okay. Yeah. So it seems like there's quite a system of checks and balances in place.
There really is, and how this myth that there's no testing required got into the public and how it persists, I'm at a loss.
Maybe that's why we're seeing all this focus on Facebook and Google's news sources. What about the one that the one we hear all the time? The GMO crops are not safe to consume.
Well, this is, again, another one. And this probably relates to the fake news stories that Google and Facebook are talking about. Every now and then you see a research report that claims to show damage from GMO crops. And there are two or three of these that surface, and a couple of them have gotten notoriety. But when they've been reviewed by the scientific community, they are ultimately retracted after they find that there's really no substantive basis behind them. The truth is that there are well over hundreds and probably now over 1,000 independent studies done looking at the safety of GMO crops. We've done animal feeding study after animal feeding study. Some people claim that the studies haven't been lifelong, but they actually have been. Many of the studies that have been done in the labs have actually been what we call transgenerational, where we will feed laboratory animals genetically engineered crops, not only through their life, but until they reproduce. And so the GMO crops have actually been studied for causing birth defects and worries like that. So this has been really well studied. Another interesting aspect of this is that we can, count the number of studies, we can pile up the papers, and we can get the weight of the scientific evidence. But a little bit of common sense and a little bit of real-world experience goes a long way in this too. There was one paper that came out that claimed that Roundup and Roundup Ready crops caused mammary tumors in 70% of the rats that ate them within 2 months of exposure. So the real world common sense side of this is that farm animals, livestock, have been eating Roundup Ready crops for 15 to 20 years now. And if these crops caused mammary tumors in 70% of the animals that consumed them, we wouldn't have a dairy industry. We probably would have noticed this by now. And this observation was recently kind of formalized in a study done out of UC Davis that's gotten into the popular press, and it was called the Trillion Meal Study. This was a really interesting study, really well done, just very simple, common sense idea. This group looked at state veterinary records from livestock production over the past couple of decades, and they split those health records into two piles. A pre-1996 pile. 1996 was the year that the first genetically engineered crop came on the market, and then a post-1996 pile. So they examined the health records of animals that were grown before or after the introduction of GMO livestock feed. They looked at lots of different animals: cows, dairy cattle, beef cattle, pigs, turkeys, chickens, ducks, excuse me, many different kinds of livestock, and they looked at many different measures of health. They looked at growth rate, slaughter weight, spontaneous abortion rate in cattle, mastitis in dairy cattle. Very thorough study looking at lots of different animals, lots of different health outcomes. And what they found was that there was no adverse health event noted after the introduction of genetically engineered crops. If anything, livestock productivity and health both increased after the introduction of genetically engineered crops. So in the laboratory, we've got hundreds, if not over 1,000 studies really looking at this, trying to find evidence for adverse health events. And then we've got real-world experience, and quite a bit of it. The Trillion Meal Study was named the Trillion Meal Study because the authors calculated that the health records they looked at comprised 100 billion different animals, and they figured that each had had at least 10 servings of a genetically engineered crop, and thus this Trillion Meal Study.
That's quite the sample size. It is. And then I think, before we move out of criticism entirely, the other big one is Monsanto. And how do you respond to the criticism surrounding that company?
Well, this is one of the discussions that we should probably have as a society, and where the issue becoming very polarized probably does us a disservice. Monsanto is the biggest, most successful company in the GMO plant arena. They've made lots of profits, and they've got a few products that have been very, very successful. And in the public, there are a couple of different ways we could look at this, and maybe a couple of different questions we should ask. America, we pride ourselves on being a capitalistic society. We love Microsoft. We love Apple. Everybody wants the latest iPhone. And we cherish this ideal that you can invent something and follow the American dream, get economic gain out of ideas. But this is really not a universal idea. When we have a Wall Street crash or pharmaceutical companies gouging the price of EpiPens or something, I think this shows that we really end up having a love-hate relationship with capitalism and technology. Sometimes we're skeptical of technology, and sometimes I believe rightly so. But we as a society really need to discuss and decide whether or not we're comfortable with companies involved in our food supply, being able to profit from it, being able to apply new technology to it. But I think we would really benefit from a rational, factual discussion rather than the smearing and fear-mongering that surrounds this. All the Monsanto is the evil empire, and Monsanto is here to control the world by gaining domination of the food supply, and all those conspiracy theories like that.
So now, moving out of myth territory, let's talk about the factual positives. What are the benefits of GMOs?
Well, the two biggest ones on the market now are the herbicide tolerant and the insect resistant, the Roundup Ready and the BT. And we've already gone over some of the benefits. The BT crops in particular, they allow crop production. They allow us to produce crops without losses to insects, and they allow us to do that with greatly reduced insecticide use. Everybody's worried about pesticide residues on the grocery store shelf, and insecticide residues are high on the list of things that we really don't need to have in our food. And the use of the BT crops lets us reduce pesticide residues on the grocery shelf by a lot. The herbicide-tolerant crops let farmers essentially do weeding with a sprayer instead of a tiller or other things. And one of the benefits of the herbicide-tolerant crops is they allow no-till planting, where the farmer doesn't have to plow the field to plow the weeds under before he plants his crop. This greatly reduces soil erosion. Now, one of the things that people are opposed to is they say that the herbicide-tolerant crops have increased herbicide use. And that is true. They've marginally increased herbicide use by about 5 to 10%. Herbicides before GMO crops are in a non-Roundup Ready or non-herbicide tolerant GMO crop. There's still a lot of herbicide use. You apply a pre-plant to kill all the weeds before you go in, and then you apply selective herbicides that try to target your weeds instead of the crop you're growing. So we really use herbicides extensively, even in non-herbicide tolerant crops. One of the benefits that people don't always appreciate about the Roundup Ready crops is that not all herbicides are created equal. Different herbicides are literally different chemicals, and different chemicals will have different lifetimes in the environment, different levels of human toxicity, different risks associated with them. And when you compare different herbicides, Roundup is one of the safest ones around. It's got very, very low mammalian toxicity, very, very short persistence in the environment relative to other herbicides we use. So the herbicide-tolerant crops, on the one hand, it is true that they have marginally increased herbicide use, but they've arguably pushed us over into using much, much safer, much less environmentally damaging herbicides than we relied on before.
So it sounds like another case of not looking at the full picture.
It really is. And it's unfortunate. There's a lot of substance that we could be talking about here and a lot of real legitimate education that we could do. And it's not that people need to accept these, but I think that my goal is not to convince people to use the technology, but to give people an accurate set of facts that they can use to decide rather than an extremely biased set of information.
Now, I went through plenty of the myths that I've heard of, but as far as benefits I've heard of as well, we haven't touched on drought resistance. I hear that brought up a lot.
Drought resistance is one of the exciting traits that, excuse me,
quite all right.
Try and keep my cold under control today. Drought resistance is one of the really exciting traits that's probably coming in the future. It's not on the market as far as I'm aware today, but there are a lot of research groups that are getting interesting results from it. The population is growing, the climate is changing, and one of the very, very sure predictions for the future is that water is going to become more limiting for human beings. And not just water for taking showers and washing our dishes, but also water that we use for agriculture to grow our crops. That's the biggest use of water that we have as a society today. So as water becomes more limiting, droughts are going to have a larger impact on agriculture, even as the population grows and agriculture needs to produce more to feed a larger population. The drought-resistant traits that they're looking at now and some of the results they're getting, we think we could reduce losses to drought stress significantly going forward if these things perform as well in the field in the future as they look like they're going to, based on the lab results that people are seeing today.
Have you personally taken part in any research around drought resistance?
No, the drought resistance, I've only watched what other people are doing. My lab is mostly focused on preventing losses to disease, so disease resistance genes and things like that.
Well, are there any other innovations in the agriculture area you would like to touch on before we?
There are lots and lots of them, and weed control is a really interesting one. A lot of people are worried about increased herbicide use now that we've got the herbicide-tolerant crops. There was a really clever idea that came out of a lab at UC Davis, Pam Ronald's research group at UC Davis. She found a gene for flood tolerance that's used in rice. Everybody knows you plant rice underwater. It grows underwater for a few weeks, then you drain the field and the rice crop grows. Plants actually drown underwater, most plants. They cannot remain submerged for very long. And rice is rather unique in this ability. But they found the genes that enable this flood tolerance, and they're looking at engineering those into other crops. And this would allow, if it's successful, it would allow chemical-free weed control. And the way that would work is you could plant your crop and then flood the field to kill all the weeds and then drain the field, and your crop would have survived and can now grow in a field where all the weeds were killed by the flooding without any herbicide use at all. Oh, so lots of exciting, innovative things coming.
That's very clever.
Yeah, it is.
And then finally, what about disease-resistant crops?
Disease-resistant crops have had a little impact on the market already, and they're going to be a big part of the future. Disease-resistant papaya plants are one that's on the market now. I'm not sure, the public is probably not aware, but papaya production worldwide was threatened by a virus called papaya ring spot virus that was spreading worldwide in the 80s and 90s. This virus ended up being lethal, actually killing the trees, and really posed a risk for wiping out papaya plantations around the world. Scientists looking at this problem at the time found that there was a mild strain of the virus that they could use to sort of immunize the papaya trees. So the way that this worked was that they would intentionally infect the papaya plants with a mild strain of the virus, and they would tolerate a little bit of yield loss and some blemished fruit. But by doing this, they almost in a way, immunized the plants, and it prevented infection by the severe strain that would kill the papaya trees. So we spent a couple of decades getting papayas in the grocery store that were infected with this mild strain of the virus. And that was a necessary step. This cross protection allowed the plantations to avoid being wiped out by the severe strain of the virus. The papayas that we have on the market today, the genetically engineered papayas, the scientists looking at this cross protection phenomenon figured out that they didn't need the complete mild strain of the virus. It was only one protein from the mild strain. So when they genetically engineered this capsid protein from the mild strain of the virus into papaya plants, what they produced were plants that were not infected with the mild strain of the virus, didn't have blemished fruit, didn't have reduced yields, but were still immune to the severe strain of the virus. So this allowed papaya planters around the world to avoid papaya ring spot virus. They were no longer facing getting wiped out by it. And we put papayas on the market that really had the same gene that we'd been consuming for a couple of decades already. The safety side of this question, we've been eating fruit that contained the mild strain of the virus, this cross-protected fruit. That was the only way we could get papayas in the grocery store over a couple of decades. And now we've got genetically engineered papaya that just have one of those proteins in it. So the logical side of this says that these papayas already should be pretty safe. We've got lots of history of humans consuming the coat protein of the mild strain. And yet the people opposed to genetic engineering, for whatever reason, think that there's unknown risks associated with this. I should add that the BT crops that are on the market are actually a very, very similar story. The BT gene, I told you, comes out of a soil bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis. There's a very popular and very widely used insecticide that's been on the market for several decades called dipel. It turns out the active ingredient in dipel is the Bacillus thuringiensis bacteria. And since it's a naturally occurring soil bacteria, dipel is an insecticide that's actually approved for use in organic agriculture. So humans, our society, we've got decades of experience eating dipel-treated crops or eating crops that have been treated with a complete whole Bacillus thuringiensis bacteria. And the BT insect-resistant crops that are on the market are only expressing one gene out of the 6,000 or so that are in that soil bacteria. So on the one hand, the BT crops, they're literally using one gene out of a bacteria that's been approved for use as an organic insecticide for several decades. But we take the one gene out, and everybody forgets to think about that when we consider the safety. And
right.
goes on to question how rational this is and whether or not it's a good idea.
Yeah, well, it's hard to slap that on a bumper sticker. It sounds like
it is, and this is part of the difficulty I think that scientists face. People like me like to go into lots of detail, and we'll ramble on and on and on. And we need to find a way to come up with some simple messages that clearly communicate the substance of the issues.
Right. Well, I mean, I appreciate you taking the time. I mean, we're already at about half an hour where we've spent speaking about this, and it's hard to condense that type of information into a headline or into a easy to digest article, don't you think?
It is. It is a challenge, but it's. I think it's one that's going to be necessary. I think both sides have to meet halfway. We've got a public that needs to not buy into misinformation so easily, critical thinking and scientific literacy, but it's easy for the scientists to stand up and say that the public has to be better sifters of information and evaluators of truth. And the truth is the scientists have some responsibility for communicating some of these issues more clearly as well.
Well, if anyone out there wants more information, are there any websites you would recommend to go to?
Yeah, there are a couple of good ones. And the one that comes to my head right off the top is there's a website called GMO Answers, and I think it's a .com. I can't remember for sure.
I pulled it up in preparation for this. It is a .com.
All right. Well, it's they go through a lot of the common myths. They've got a frequently asked questions, lots of good information, and I think they actually present it in a fairly unbiased, unemotional, here's a question, there's the answer sort of a format.
Definitely go check it out. Well-designed website as well. Well, Dr. Hanson, again, I really appreciate your time. Is there anywhere else you would like folks to go and check out, or is GMOanswers.com the go-to place?
Well, that's the one that came off the top of my head today. Maybe one of these days I'll have to put a website together.
All right. Well, thank you again, and thank you everyone for listening, and we will see you next time.
All right. Thank you.